So, welcome back. This is part 2 of Budgeting Fundamentals. In the previous video, we discussed purposes, we discussed parts of a budget and the relationship between institutional goals and the budget. In this video, we're going to continue on with discussing the purposes of the budget. We've already discussed how a budget is a financial representation of the institution's plan, how a budget is a contract, not a guarantee, between management and the functional unit, and then how it's a control mechanism, how budgets help us to monitor spending so that institutions do not have a budget deficit at the end of the year, as well as to ensure that functional unit budget managers are spending money as agreed upon. Next, we're going to look at how a budget helps to forecast the financial picture of an institution. So, forecasting may be a new term for you, but really what forecasting is looking to the future, projecting what will occur in the future. And so, budget managers are expected to provide forecasts for revenue and expenditures. Enrollment managers are expected to project the revenue for tuition and fees based off the estimated enrollment of new freshmen, returning students, international students, out-of-state students. Basically any student group that would pay, that you would cohort and would pay a different rate of tuition and fees. Housing folks are expected to forecast revenue for residential hall occupancy. Our annual giving officers and development officers are expected to forecast revenue of potential gifts, private donations for the next year. And expenditures are the same way. Budget managers forecast maintenance and updates with information technology, both hardware and software. Your maintenance director or director of building maintenance and facilities will often forecast expenditures based off of needed maintenance or preventative maintenance across campus. Sometimes we have fixed costs that are easy to project and forecast related to utilities, water, electricity, and then benefit costs. Based off our conversations with healthcare providers, whoever your pension is through, you know how much to plan in relation to employee benefit costs. But if you want to think about the essence of preparing a budget, these forecasts are essential. And if your projection is off by much, it could really damage the potential for your budget. If I've basically said that I'll give you $10 to do what you want to do, and I have projected that we're going to have revenue for $10, but we fall short of that, then as an institution, it's difficult for me to meet my commitment to you, the functional unit manager. And so, pro forma financial statements, again, may be a new term to you, and I encourage you, there's a video in our course shell about pro forma statements. But I encourage you to get familiar, where you can take a look at revenue minus expenditures equals net. And typically when you look at a budget, you'll see that the budget will provide revenue streams, especially with tuition, as gross, and then less with a net. And when you do this for the entire budget, your goal is to zero out or balance out your revenues with your expenditures. That's always the goal of a nonprofit budget. End up at zero. And the best way that you can do that is by having accurate projections. Based on these projections, we know whether or not to be conservative or liberal in our risk tolerance. Risk tolerance may be a new term for you. Risk tolerance basically means that do I have the means to plan expenditures loosely? Or do we need to minimize expenditures because we're not anticipating great revenue gains? And so here's an example. If one of my strategic initiatives, this would be something that maybe a director of transfer services would offer. And so if I have a strategic initiative that wants me to increase enrollment from one number to a next, I'm going to provide a forecast or a pro forma to see how much revenue will be produced based off my enrollment benchmarks. And so each year I set a benchmark for enrollment. I estimate what the tuition increase will be. And then on this statement, I get a sense for, with the increase in enrollment and the increase in tuition, how much revenue will we produce? I'll do the same with expenditures. If I plan to increase enrollment by that much, there's a cost to that. And so I want to increase the expenditures that my office will need on an annual basis, FY's fiscal year, for us to know how much it'll cost each year or over a period of years in order to successfully meet my institutional goal. A budget's an indicator of risk tolerance. High risk tolerance means that you're less likely to budget contingencies. We anticipate generating a great deal of revenue, so therefore we have a high risk tolerance. This may be institutions that are more selective, that serve a higher, more academically inclined group of students. Maybe schools of prestige, if you want to think about it like that have large endowments, billion-dollar plus endowments. Maybe not necessarily reliant on states for funding. But it's a scale from high risk to low risk. Low risk would mean that you want to budget revenues conservatively because there's a chance that you will not bring in the revenue that you hope for. And private liberal arts institutions with a very small endowment or state-assisted regional institutions that are not anticipating a great deal of appropriations from the state may budget with a very low risk tolerance. And so one of the things I'd like for you to do, give thought to what would be some scenarios where an institution may be in a position of high risk tolerance versus low risk tolerance. Go ahead and pause the video and give some thought to what would be some characteristics of an institution that budgets with high risk tolerance versus low risk tolerance. Budgets are also political instruments. So there are constant negotiations. There are constant initiatives between the federal government and institutions, the state government and institutions. And so that if the state wants a particular program to be successful, just like an institution in its goals, it's going to allocate money. So here in Kentucky, a program that's been wildly successful from the past gubernatorial administration is the Work Ready Kentucky program. And so initially, Work Ready received a sizable allocation, and institutions that fell in line with the criteria for the Work Ready program tried to demonstrate their alignment with this state initiative. I encourage you to take a look at the Work Ready program to see what institutions and what institutional types here in Kentucky aligned well with that. But if you recognize that there is a natural fit for a state initiative or a federal initiative, it can very well help you to acquire greater levels of revenue. Dual credit program is another one. All institutions are expected to offer dual credit. There's a lot of mixed emotions about this. Compliance is another. So we will provide you funding if, and then fill in the blank. And so institutions are constantly looking to see what is it that states and the federal government desire and has money associated with it, so that they may be able to increase their potential for revenue. The problem is that sometimes these are short-funded mandates, and in the long term, funding dries up. And you still have to report compliance. And so I think about programs like the Clery Act or IDEA or Title IX. These were all federal initiatives that had some funding or were associated with maybe a loss of funding that institutions now are responsible to make sure that compliance continues. And it could very well consume anywhere from 5 to 7% of your operating cost just on compliance-related matters, related to personnel, related to records and privacy, related to safety and security. So when you think about it as a political instrument, yes, what initiatives are available that have some level of funding, but also it's a political instrument in terms of compliance. But these are the 6 primary purposes of a budget.